Welcome to the second season of Coffee and Conflict, the National Security Institute's literary podcast, where I welcome leading experts to discuss their research, their books, and the most pressing defense and foreign policy issues of the day. I'm your host, Joshua Huminski, a senior fellow at NSI and senior vice president at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. So grab your first or second coffee of the day and let's begin. I'm joined by Mark Galeotti. He is one of the world's leading experts on Russian crime and security, which are often one and the same, which may explain why Moscow banned him in 2022. After a stint with the Foreign Office, he has been a scholar, a think tanker in London, New York, Moscow, Prague, and Florence. He now heads the consultancy Mayak Intelligence and is an honorary professor at the University College London and a senior fellow with RUSI and the Council on Geostrategy, an excellent institution, if I may say so. A prolific author, he frequently acts as a consultant to various governments, commercial and law enforcement agencies, and has briefed everyone from prime ministers to CEOs. He is also the podcast host of the peerless source of all things Russian, In Moscow's Shadows, which is my most listened to and favorite non-Formula One podcast. So I have to throw that in there. Mark, welcome back to Coffee and Conflict.
I'm delighted to be here, though in my case it is more tea and turmoil, shall we say.
Well, I'm glad that you have a cup of tea. We're here today to discuss what is an absolutely fantastic new book, yours new book actually, Homo Criminalis, How Crime Organises the World. I want to start with some first principles here. So when most people think of organized crime, certainly in the United States, they'll go to Al Capone or they'll go to Tony Soprano and waste management, or maybe the Cray twins for our British audience. But what exactly is organized crime?
Well, look, I mean, unfortunately, we could fill the entire podcast with some slightly arid discussions about exactly what makes organised crime. There are umpteen different definitions. Suffice it to say that not all crime that is organised crime. You know, if three people just decide on the spur of the moment to go and rob a convenience store, and one of them is going to wave a knife around, one of them is going to try and grab the money from the till, and the third one is sitting in the car ready to get them away, technically speaking, they have just organised themselves. No one would describe that as organised crime. Essentially, organised crime is a long-term criminal conspiracy, which is directed primarily towards gaining profit and power, rather than, for example, political change. It's what distinguishes it from terrorists, even though they often use the same sort of methodology, and which does so over a period of time and with some kind of sense of both hierarchy and sort of social connectivity between the members. I mean, nowadays they may not even have met or be in the same country, if we're talking about, for example, cybercrime gangs. But nonetheless, there has to be some degree of that connectivity. So that's a very broad description. But in some ways, I just make one other point, which particularly when, given the fact the first third of my book is essentially historical, as you say, pushing it rather further back than the Crays and Al Capone, is that it is obviously defined by law, in the sense of we essentially define our threat surface. We decide what things we're going to make illegal. And in the process, we tend to create criminal markets. And that's where organised crime operates. So there are things that today we'd regard as organised crime. Once upon a time, they were absolutely fine.
And I do want to come back to that, but the history component of this, I think, is absolutely fascinating. Because again, certainly when you think about, I think the average person thinks about organized crime, it's very much like sort of 1920s prohibition type thing. But you go all the way back to Aztec cocoa bean counterfeiting. And
one of my favorite examples, I must say.
I mean, could you just talk about that story? I mean, it's really fascinating.
Yeah, well, I mean, for context, essentially organised crime is the dark underside, the shadow of organised society. So when societies aren't very organised, they probably aren't really criminalising all that much, and there's not much scope or need for organised crime. The more it gets organised, the more that societies get more serious about banning things, about taxing things, and also about enforcing their laws, then the greater opportunity and need there is for crime to become organised. And if you take the Aztecs as an example, I mean, the Aztecs had a actually very complex and sophisticated society in their own rather bloodthirsty way. And as a result, there was a considerable premium on organising yourself, because you don't necessarily want to be killed in one of the many and inventive ways that the Aztec state had decided. And given that the Aztecs' notion of the cocoa bean is not only that it makes this, frankly, rather bitter. It's not like modern hot chocolate. But anyway, this drink, which is of an immense ritual and political importance, but also the cocoa bean is currency. And like all currencies, it becomes prone to counterfeiting, which could be anything from a bean that is carved out of the pith of some fruit, all the way up to being made out of dried dung. Now, the thing is, if you're trying to basically launder your money that is actually made of dried dung, which might then in due course find itself being made into a drink, which immediately I would suspect makes it quite visible that it's not the real thing. Well, you don't want to draw attention to yourself. So what we had were not only these sort of complex networks of people who are making the cocoa beans, but they had their own networks of launderers, of, on the whole, merchants who would take consignments of these fake cocoa beans to far-flung cities, where there they would sift them into the general commerce, so that it became much, much less evident where the source of these counterfeit cocoa beans were. Because precisely, if it became too obvious, the authorities would in due course find you and do inventive but lethal things to you.
I want to touch on something there that you raised about sort of that sort of middleman component, the friction point between, as you write, sort of the upper world and the underworld. And I really love this quote here. You write, "Our dynamic, interconnected, globalized, networked, cross-cultural world is so permeated by organized crime that it's very hard to see where the upper world ends and the underworld begins. The way as the one becomes more complex, so does the other, and the manner in which they buttress as often as challenge each other tells us most about ourselves and how we end up organizing ourselves." Could you talk about that sort of friction component? Because you're talking about, you have the organized crime, obviously, with these launderers, these counterfeiters, if you will, and then you have the launderers, which bring these things into the illicit economy. And could you talk about that sort of upper world, underworld nexus?
Yeah, and look, I mean, this is particularly, but not exclusively, a modern phenomenon. But the bottom line is this. For many within the upper world, the legitimate world, there are clear economic advantages to dealing with the criminals, so long as they are not making this too obvious. I mean, the same way as in the modern era, if you turned up to a bank in the City of London with a suitcase full of cocaine-smeared $100 bills, they would call the police. If you've had the courtesy to pre-wash it through various different banking institutions in slightly sort of less salubrious but increasingly so jurisdictions, and then turn up in the guise of some import-export specialist, there might be some questions about provenance, but essentially they will happily welcome your money. So, on the one hand, there is a clear direct advantage. Often there is a desire not to pick too many fights. I mean, they're often the case that actually, states and state agencies decide willfully to turn a blind eye because they never have as many resources as they need, or actually working with the criminals is useful. You have outright corruption, where individuals are just simply suborned by the criminals. Again, there's been corruption so long as there have been states. And particularly in the modern world, it's often just very, very difficult to know. Money has now become an entirely virtual commodity that pings around the world at the speed of electronic transmissions. Commodities that may be the result of all kinds of nefarious activities get moved around, and it becomes very, very hard to trace. I mean, for me, one of the fascinating examples was the sand mafia. Sand, which is absolutely crucial for construction, and therefore we have criminals who are illegally sucking it out from the beds of rivers in China and beaches in India. Now, how do you actually tell, this is dirty sand, this is hot sand, rather than that legitimate sand? So, I mean, I think there is a degree to which, much like the way that sand can be mixed so that you can't tell the legal from the illegal, so too almost with near any commodity that isn't outrightly legal. There is no legal cocaine, but nonetheless, many of the goods that the criminals are dealing with are essentially legal products, but maybe untaxed, counterfeited, stolen, or whatever. In that case, increasingly, as the world becomes more globalized, as commerce becomes more and more frictionless, it becomes harder and harder to tell the one from the other.
And sticking with that, one of the things that I thought was quite interesting was how certain behaviors or activities at one point were illegal or illegitimate and then transitioned into legitimate and legal behaviors. I mean, the origins of HSBC, for example, I mean, the biggest bank, one of the biggest banks in the world right now, is very much from a very illegal foundation in many ways. Could you talk about that?
Yes, I mean, essentially that was very, very heavily involved in the opium trade from British India into China. And again, this was entirely legal in British India, but was often actually a deeply illegalized trade in China. But when the Chinese tried to actually impose their laws, in part for reasons that were geopolitical as much as anything else, what happened? Well, they were shelled. The gunboats were sent in, and they were delivered a sort of a salutary warning not to mess with a money-making imperial venture. So there's no sense that HSBC, well, its precursor, was directly involved in criminal action, unless you happen to be on the other side of the border and you're a Chinese official thinking about it. And that's often the case. Look, I mean, sometimes it's even more direct. I mean, for me, the fascinating example is always the use of crime as a weapon, particularly privateers, who are just simply pirates whom you have given a letter of marque which approves their actions so long as they're pirating the right people. So whether it's the British or the French or the Spanish or the Dutch or whoever, many of these use privateers as means of waging economic warfare against their enemies by, in effect, recruiting pirates to their cause. And so long as they stayed within the terms of the letter of marque, the target would clearly regard them as criminals, but you would consider them to be legitimate agents of the state.
And for the record, we're not accusing HSBC of doing anything malign or nefarious at the present time. This is purely historical. I should probably add that in there for any lawyers that may or may not be listening to this. But speaking about the pirates example, if I'm not mistaken, certainly the United States dealt with the Barbary pirates at one point paying some absurd amount of treasury revenue to offset the attacks of the pirates, and then it just sort of became fed up. At what point does the state, in your view, sort of historically, decide to address organized crime? Is there a point at which it becomes too prevalent of an issue, too significant, and then it has to be state action taken to address this?
Yeah, it tends to be that point where actually the criminals begin to pose a direct threat to the state, or at least they are seen to be done so. I mean, let's take the example of Italy. I mean, Italy, under the fascist regime, in many ways, the Sicilian mafia was not destroyed, but I would say beaten down. A lot of its individual sort of members forced to flee, incidentally, to the United States in many cases. But nonetheless, it was under control. But that required the deployment of sort of fascist law enforcement capacities. When the mafia was allowed to resurge in Sicily and various counterparts in the south of Italy after World War II, in part because of essentially a deal that had been struck with the Allied forces, well, then you had a period in which actually the mafia and the Christian Democrat Party led governing coalitions had a nice, cosy understanding. Mafia would do their things and make money, and in return they would not only bribe individual politicians, but they would bring the vote out for the Christian Democrat Party. And for a long time that seemed to work, just as a similar kind of deal in Japan between the Yakuza and the ruling Liberal Democrats did. But over time that became less and less comfortable, particularly as the mafia moved into drug trafficking. Not only did it mean that their activities became more and more socially disruptive, but they also became more and more socially unacceptable. Italians who perhaps in the 1950s had been willing to accept certain kind of behaviours because they thought it was either impossible to avoid or just simply not too much of a problem, increasingly began to see the mafia as a problem. And when the mafia killed two particularly prominent investigative judges, Judges Falcone and Borsellino, then in many ways kicking and screaming, a state which really didn't want to break its alliance with the mafia, nonetheless was forced to unleash the law enforcement agencies who had for a long time been chafing at the constraints upon them. So in this case, it wasn't because they actually thought organised crime was a problem in objective terms, shall we say. It's just that they thought if we don't allow this to happen, then politically we will be destroyed. So we need to act. So in many cases, it's really about the self-interest of the states and the individuals who run those states. And look, one can point to many examples. But more often than not, the answer is, in fact, that organised crime is just simply reined in to the point it no longer becomes a challenge. One can look also at Vladimir Putin. In the 1990s, Russia was in this state of pretty much primal anarchy. There was times when, Moscow and St. Petersburg, in the worst periods, it's almost a nightly occurrence that there'll be a drive-by shooting here, a car bombing there, or whatever. And people felt insecure and angry and uncertain. Then Putin comes in on very much a law and order platform. And I remember talking to a Russian criminal at that time who slept with a suitcase under his bed, just as had been done during the Stalin era, when people thought they might be dragged to the Gulag. Though in his case, it was if he got a tip-off from one of his many informants within the police or the judiciary that there was an arrest warrant to be issued, he could grab that suitcase, which was presumably full of false documents and cash, and head for the airport. Now, he never had to use that suitcase, because it very quickly became clear that for all that he'd said, Putin was not serious about cracking down on organised crime as such. He was interested in cracking down on the activities of organised crime that posed a challenge to his state. The drive-by shootings and bombings and things, they made it look as if the state was not in control of the streets. So he didn't have a problem with contract killings continuing, and in fact, through the noughts, the level of contract killing was pretty much at the same level as in the 1990s. But whereas in the 1990s, maybe it would have been done with a drive-by shooting, and a lot of people would have got scared, and a lot of innocent people would have got killed. Now it tended to be just the target and the target's driver bodyguard who got killed, and no one really cared about that. Everyone, I remember talking to some Muscovites who'd had a contract killing close to where they lived, and I said, isn't this worrying? And they said, no, because we don't live in that world. In that sense of, it was just nasty people preying on nasty people. So that was as far as Putin felt he needed to go. He needed to go far enough to satisfy society that he had made the streets safe for them. But he certainly didn't regard this as a primary objective compared with, say, crushing dissent or indeed the Chechens, who again posed a security threat.
And I do want to come back to Russian organized crime specifically, but I'm curious the extent to which it sounds, and do correct me if I'm wrong here, that President Putin put sort of the constraints on the limits of organized crime, sort of established boundaries with which it could operate. But are there examples where you saw the state sort of co-opt criminal networks to further foreign policy objectives or even sort of domestic interests of the state?
Well, I mean, that's very much been the Russian approach. If one looks at many of the attacks currently being sort of perpetrated in Europe, they're not carried out by card-carrying Russian intelligence officers. They're just local thugs. And in some cases, they're just recruited off the dark net, almost, situation wanted. Someone want to blow up an IKEA for us. And in other cases, and to be perfectly honest, although I absolutely wouldn't advocate it, who of us who's been to an IKEA has not at one point wanted to blow it up? But at the same time, in other cases, they're clearly recruited through organised crime networks to which the Russian mafia is linked. So, we have seen in Russia proscription. These are the things you mustn't do. Move into prescription. These are the things we'd like you to do. But an even more compelling example for me is North Korea. I mean, North Korea has its Bureau 39, which is in effect a ministry of organised crime. These are the people who carry out what are often massive online frauds. These are the people who arrange for the production of methamphetamines within government chemical facilities. These are the people who, again, within the context of the government mint, produce what are still the best counterfeit $100 bills. And this is all precisely to generate revenue, which can help this ramshackle and impoverished, indeed starving state still survive. And the fact that it also undermines the economies of nations that they consider to be their enemies, that's a plus. But as I said, the very fact that it's so institutionalized, at least in countries like Russia, it's still a fairly ad hoc relationship. Whereas in North Korea, it has been brought right into the heart of the state.
Have you seen any examples of sort of the inversion of that co-optation, where you see, organized crime groups within states almost become the state, either de facto or in practice? I mean, we see certainly in recent years in Mexico with the cartels, where the cartels almost become having the monopoly of the use of violence in some of these states. Do you see evidence of sort of the inversion of this co-optation?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I mean, we shouldn't be surprised if one looks, and this is again one of the theses of the early sections of the book, at how originally states were created. In effect, states are often created by the more powerful but also the smarter bandits. There are the roving bandits, to use Mancur Olson's terminology, who come in, steal everything they can get. They don't care if the community they're preying on survives or not, because they're moving on to somewhere else. And then the stationary bandits who think, we're going to take over. And yes, they start by stealing, but they're smart enough to realise that you don't cook and eat the goose that lays the golden eggs. You steal as much as you can while preserving the integrity of the local community's ability to continue to act, because you want to be able to steal tomorrow and the day after and the day after. And in many ways, these are precisely the antecedents of the modern states, with all their glories and their respectable pedigrees. So we shouldn't be surprised that actually this also happens where we see state collapse in particular. Now, sometimes that is actual state collapse. One could look at, say, Afghanistan. One can look at Somalia. And, which are the entities which begin to emerge to fill the role of local states in these places, whether we're talking about, Puntland in Somalia, or whether we're talking about various warlords, tribal chieftains and so forth in Afghanistan. Someone will fill that vacuum. So sometimes it's actually direct. And if you look at somewhere like, say, Mexico, well, there, it's not actually as if the Mexican government fell and collapsed and disappeared. It's more that just simply its incapacity to be able to control all its territory, particularly given just the sheer scale and flow of illegal product, whether we're talking drugs or migrants, flooding through it northwards to the United States, is such that it was outgunned. One could also just as easily look at many of the favelas in Brazil, and the degree to which, for a while they often became no-go areas for the state, little micro-kingdoms, which then had to be often very bloodily reconquered by the state to return. I think this is a natural process. Again, we're not used to it in advanced Western democratic societies, despite all the talk of no-go areas and such like that. Doesn't really apply. But nonetheless, even in our own societies, I mean, I know from my own experiences, for example, doing a ride-along with New Jersey state troopers into some of the rougher parts, shall we say, of Newark, New Jersey, that there are areas where the state can inject its forces, but those forces are then going to be needed somewhere else, and they'll move on. But in the absence of that kind of direct state intervention, actually it's the local gangs that are the local states in effect, usually highly exploitative, highly inefficient ones. But in some cases, particularly if the actual state itself begins to retreat further and further, these gangs may well begin to actually respond by, in effect, taking up more and more of those state roles.
One of the things I thought was quite fascinating across the book is sort of as the state grew and organized itself, so did organized crime grow and adapt. But it's also that the technological adaptation that you see throughout this, so that in many ways, the criminal enterprises and criminal organizations that you write about were more cutting edge in finding out those loopholes and ways to take advantage of the system than the system itself. So, can you talk about this sort of adaptation cycle and sort of criminal innovation? Because you write everything from cybercrime, which we'll come to in a moment, but just how does that adaptation cycle happen, and how have you seen it sort of evolve in your research?
Well, it's a very Darwinian process, because organized crime groups are almost invariably in competition with other groups, directly over turf and markets, or indirectly over the loyalties of people around them. And so you can't necessarily afford to just simply sit back, unless you are sitting on top of a particularly and extraordinarily lucrative trade, to think, I will not seek to take advantage of any new opportunities, because you will get outflanked. Now, that said, we have a tendency to focus on the successful ones, and we should always note that most criminals are morons. Most criminals will not have long and successful careers. They will end up dead or in prison. But of course, the ones we see, the ones we note, the ones who actually shape the environment are going to be the successful ones. And precisely because criminals have so many fewer constraints on their actions, they don't have to worry about environmental health impacts. They don't have to worry about whether or not they have a patent before they can exploit something or anything like that. They are therefore often in a position to be early movers. Now, often then states will then catch up. But the point is that crime can therefore operate at the, to use this sort of ghastly new term, the bleeding edge of new adaptations. So if you look at, for example, who were amongst the early users of drones to do things particularly like dropping off packages of drugs or cell phones into prison yards, it was criminals. The same drones that we then see used on an industrial scale in the war in Ukraine. 3D printers. 3D printers, again, which have the capacity to basically build you, well, anything from as simple as a knife to a very crude and often very inaccurate gun that you can use, and yet which will not trigger metal detectors. All of these things, someone has the bright idea. New variations of existing narcotics, because there is always that premium on something new. If one looks at the way, for example, cannabis has become much, much more powerful over time, or how there's a constant desire to come up with the new latest dance drug, which may well pretty much be the same as the old dance drug. There's a lot of marketing involved here as well. But nonetheless, perhaps it has a slightly different effect or feel, and therefore people think, oh, this must be new and cool. There is this constant demand because, as I said, it's Darwinist. If you do not do so, your rivals may well do so. And if they do, and if they suddenly are successful about this, they will have a lot more money, and money buys you muscle, directly in terms of men with guns, but also muscle in the sense of the capacity to bankroll further operations, to corrupt local politicians and law enforcement and such like. And this is how you find yourself being outflanked by your upstart rivals. So in that respect, although most criminals are not smart, criminal networks often begin to acquire a surprising degree of sophistication. Again, and if we look at Latin American drug cartels, whose individual members, I think it is fair to say, would rarely be described as sophisticated operators. But nonetheless, as they start to bring in expertise, everything from the people who can make semi-submersibles to smuggle their drugs, to the financial managers who can launder them around the world with a few keystrokes, the organisation as a whole begins to become quite effective, quite innovative, and quite fast-moving.
In light of that, if we invert the equation, you have law enforcement agencies that perpetually seem to be on the back foot because they're responding to crimes. They're responding to crimes that are violations of existing law. In some cases, the law isn't adapted sufficiently fast enough. Your example about the drug chemicals, the drugs and the chemicals that go into them is fascinating because I remember speaking to somebody and they said, well, they just tweak a little molecule and that technically is no longer considered to be banned. And it's the same exact thing, but there's one extra oxygen molecule or something like that. So from a law enforcement perspective, how does one balance sort of addressing the crimes that exist today, but also trying to anticipate the crimes of the future?
Yeah, this is always a real challenge, and not so much, you might say, at the kind of beat cop level, because you are therefore trying to respond and deter. And it's worth noting in Sideline that I always feel somewhat unfair. People always say, oh, but the criminals are the ones who essentially call the shots. The police are constantly in response, and there's still lots of crime, and that's perfectly true. But we don't tend to complain about fire services. We don't say, well, look, there are all these firefighters around, and yet we still have fires. You're obviously constantly just trying to minimise the outbreaks and the impacts. But yes, when one sort of looks higher up the sort of the chain of policing structures into one's agencies like, say, the FBI or Britain's National Crime Agency that are expected to also have much more of a strategic role, this is a real problem. I have never yet met a law enforcement agency that says, we have quite enough resources as is, thanks very much. We have enough officers, we have enough forensic accountants, we have enough computer specialists, we're doing fine. No, they're always feeling under pressure. They're always lacking in resources, and they are therefore facing this complex political challenge because their political masters are essentially beholden to electorates. I mean, even in authoritarian regimes, it's in effect an electorate who want safety and security on the streets, which often means officers who are patrolling, even though that is the least efficient way of using your personnel capacity. But also dealing with today's crime. No one wants to say, well, we couldn't deal with the burglary in your house because we were wondering about the potential impact of satellite technology in the future. That's not something that anyone's going to be fine with. But nonetheless, these are exactly the tough decisions that need to be made. And look, I mean, I've had some fascinating conversations with law enforcers, which often segue almost seamlessly between talking about criminal challenges and talking about science fiction. Because in many ways, that's where they're having to operate in the realm of realistic science fiction, the kind of credible near-future extrapolations that we see, in everything from the cyberpunk genre onwards. And the ability to actually marry today's challenges, tomorrow's technological opportunities, and the criminal adaptations of those opportunities for the day after tomorrow, and actually do something useful with it is at once an incredible challenge, but also one in which, it has to be said, there is a lot of innovative thinking. But the point is that you can project 15 different potential future scenarios, only one of which might actually manifest. So do you try and put resources into all 15? Do you try and hedge your bets and wait until you begin to see signs of which one of these is really going to go? These are unenviable tasks for those people who are allocating that kind of resource.
I mean, it's fascinating. We hear so much about deep fakes and AI-generated imagery and voices and whatnot, which are certainly a big problem, of course. Mm-hmm. But then one of the most successful scams, it seems right now, are these DMV texts that everyone is getting in the United States, where you have tolls that are, outstanding. And I think the Chinese organization behind this has made $1 billion+ on this, and it's just by virtue of sending out these spam texts over and over and over again. I mean, when you look at sort of that science fiction aspect, in the course of doing this research, is there a scenario in your mind that just sticks out as one as particularly interesting or even alarming?
Well, I'll tell you, I'll give you two, one on each side of the equation. I mean, one is, obviously, we often look at how technology is providing opportunities for the criminals, whether it's in terms of online banking, allowing them to move money around, or whatever else. But we also have to remember that the states tend to use technology as well, and they may be a bit slower, but they can throw much more resource at it. And therefore, there is this fascinating debate about the future of, the balance between public safety and privacy, particularly linking around new generation CCTV, so closed circuit television cameras, coupled with enough computer capacity to be able to run real-time, not just facial recognition programs, which can be spoofed by everything from as simple as wearing a big hat to particular forms of face painting, but things like gait recognition, measuring how they move, which is essentially linked to things like bone articulation and length, and therefore is not so susceptible to being spoofed, and creating the potential scenario where literally the state could know where everybody is all the time. And, well, we're nowhere near that yet, but if you look at countries like China and Russia, that is clearly the direction in which they're going. And that is, at once, you might say, the side of me that craves security thinks that's a wonderful thing, not actually being an organised criminal figure myself. The side of me that is also interested in actually not living in a dystopian law enforcement security state regards it with horror. So we'll have to see how that one plays out. So that's on the law enforcement side of things. On the criminal side of things, the thing that absolutely fascinated me, and I think, again, it's still very early days, but it was just being presented as a possibility, is essentially drugs that involve no drugs. Given that the whole point about drugs is that these are chemicals which create certain chemical effects in your brain, whether it's to calm you down or whether it's to put you in a high or whatever else. Well, other ways of essentially making the body create the same chemical effects but without the need for any kind of actual physical thing, which could be anything from electrical pulses into the brain to even potential certain patterns of light flashes. So in other words, you actually could get high just simply by shining a light into your eye. And yes, there will be all sorts of chemical effects on you, but on the other hand, there isn't the same need for something that needs to be harvested from something that might need to be grown in areas, marijuana grow houses or large swaths of Afghanistan or whatever, and then processed and then physically smuggled and then physically trafficked and sold on. It could be something that just simply is downloaded to your computer to be played. That kind of thing. Again, still, this is very much over the horizon. But the very fact that people are thinking and talking about these possibilities shows the direction in which we may be going.
Well, good luck for the legislators trying to figure out how to regulate or ban sort of light impulses. We're coming up on sort of the tail end of the podcast here, but I would be very remiss if I didn't take advantage of having you to talk about Russian organized crime in Ukraine. You've done some fascinating research and reports in recent months on this. But starting from the top, how has the Russian state's increasing reliance on criminal networks, from recruiting prisoners to leveraging gangs for logistics support, affected that traditional relationship between organized crime and the Russian state following the invasion of Ukraine?
Yeah, you see, at the moment, the apparent answer is not really at all, in the sense that this is a very sort of ad hoc and transactional thing, and it's primarily operating through the FSB, the Federal Security Service, because that is at once the agency which kind of I wouldn't say, often some of the parallels sometimes drawn with the FBI, but if so, it's Hoover's FBI, is at once the agency that is involved in policing organised crime to the greatest degree, and it is also, if we're honest, the most deeply corrupt, probably, of almost any Russian institution. So for all kinds of reasons, they are best able to leverage this and make these connections and use organised crime. And we see this, even to the point of gangs which are smuggling criminal commodities out of Russia, counterfeit goods from China or drugs from Afghanistan or traffic people or whatever, to a degree can get a free pass through Russian border controls if on the way back they smuggle something that is of value to the Russian state, which could be anything from microchips to, currently I'm told that in terms of cost effectiveness and risk effectiveness, it's actually Italian handbags are the most valuable commodity to bring in. I suppose oligarchs' wives and mistresses need their goodies somehow. So, at the moment it's still very ad hoc, and at the moment the state is very much in charge, because the state offers these opportunities and gangs can choose whether or not to say yes. However, the problem is that it's much harder to wean yourself off these kind of connections. Firstly, because you as a state begin to think of this as a perfectly normal approach. And even when there's no war in Ukraine, there will probably still be sanctions and you will be wanting to smuggle around them. There will probably still be a very tense, to put it mildly, relationship with the West. And you may well still want to do things to distract and unsettle and generally demoralize the West, and criminals can help you do that kind of thing. So, it's a sort of bit of a sliding, a slippery slope. And at the same time, there are many people within the government and security apparatus who are now personally enriching themselves. No one does anything for nothing, and it's actually there was an old Georgian curse of Soviet times: "May you live on your wages alone." No one who can do more than just live on their wages in modern Russia does, and therefore there will be lots of people who have been increasingly corrupted in this process. And it's unlikely that they will think, well, that was just for the war, but now I shall give up on all this extracurricular revenue. So I think actually what happens is the corrosive effect on the state is something that is only going to manifest after the war, which incidentally is the same time as you'll have 1 million or so traumatized, in many cases physically damaged, but in many cases I would say criminalized veterans coming back from this thoroughly dirty conflict, in which they will precisely have been fighting alongside criminals from the labour camps. And there has been clearly some degree of sort of cultural assimilation of the regular soldiers into criminal ways, because we've seen this begin to manifest itself inside Russia already. So I think at a time when, anyway, the law enforcement agencies are going to be very much hard-pressed, the police are currently 25% under strength, after all. At the same time, the combination of the veterans and the habituation of the use of criminals is going to be a very difficult thing and a very lengthy thing for Russia to wean itself off.
I mean, sticking with that and playing it out further, I mean, you're talking about, when we do get to war termination, whenever that happens, you have a very large cadre of individuals that you were just highlighting who, have fought in the wars, been sort of culturally assimilated, returning back to Russia. How do you envision that affecting sort of the Russian state and Russian society? Because I don't imagine there is a reintegration program or anything like the United Kingdom or United States has for demobilized personnel. And those are individuals who are serving in uniform and not under contract. So, what is this going to do to Putin's Russia going forward?
Yeah, it's going to be rough. I mean, I don't think in and of itself it's a reason why Putin won't want the war to end, though I do think it may well be a reason why they might try to stage the release. Remember, all these people signed a contract that says that they will serve until the end of the special military operation, and therefore they will be expecting to be allowed to go home at the end of that. I could see the state deciding to try and stage this over time, which creates the possibilities for mass mutinies and desertions, as people think, no, I've done my bit, thank you very much. I'm not going to wait another 6 months just for your convenience. I'm off home now. But yeah, this is going to be hard. And the thing that really strikes me, in some ways, is a bit of a case study in the whole Putin political system, in that a lot of the specialists in all sorts of different fields are fully aware of the problems to come. If you look at the discussion within the sort of the specialist medical press, for example, they're recognizing that particularly the nature of recruitment is such that most of these people left and will be returning to the more impoverished and often rural parts of the country, which is precisely where healthcare is at its most stretched. And so they're already saying that we really need to be building new clinics, to have mobile psychiatric units, etc. The law enforcement community is likewise fully aware of the risks. If you look at the parallels with the Soviet war in Afghanistan, the degree to which it turbocharged not just organised crime, but the violent conflicts between organised crime when the veterans came home and a certain proportion of them ended up being recruited by the gangsters. And so it goes. The Department of Labour worrying about the fact that these people are going to come back. They're used to having 3.5 times the average salary, and now they're being expected to go back to being farm hands or whatever. How do they be retrained? However, the problem is that all of this costs money, and there's no way any of this can be unlocked without push from the very top of the system, in other words, Putin. And what Putin seems to be doing is, ironically, the same sort of thing as he did with COVID, which is to essentially realize that it's a difficult, intractable and expensive problem, and therefore decide not to bother with it and dump the responsibility on others. With COVID, you had 2 separate committees, one led by the mayor of Moscow, one led by the prime minister, but there wasn't a lot of extra resource. So regional governors were basically left on their own, and some of them had good ideas, many did not. Some of them were able to eke out extra resources to deal with it, many could not. So you have a massively lopsided response. I think this is exactly what we're going to be seeing when the soldiers come home, particularly because they will be coming back to, by definition, largely the impoverished parts of the Russian Federation, where the local governors, the local authorities do not have spare capital lying around. Once the problems begin to manifest, then, as usually tends to happen, then the government will kick into gear and money will start to be distributed. By that point, it's already not too late, but late. But this is a classic problem. If Putin is not interested, you cannot strategically address the problem in the early stages. You have to wait for it to become a bit of a disaster, and that's the point when Putin gets interested, and suddenly political capital and thus actual capital get unlocked.
I want to ask you one final question, zooming out from Russia, but sort of at the macro level. I mean, this book is a fascinating study on the history of organized crime, but also the extent to which organized crime as an element of state consideration and state policy and state study, it runs in parallel. I mean, from your perspective, should organized crime and criminality writ large be studied more alongside sort of traditional ideas of national security, of defense, of foreign policy? And if so, what do you think the impact of that would be in terms of policymaking?
Yeah, I mean, I very much do. Look, let's be brutally honest. This book was a hobby project for me. I wrote it because I have a deep-seated and no doubt morally dubious fascination with these individuals and these structures. And particularly, I wanted to bring out the historical dimension and actually how it plays into the modern world. However, absolutely, I think the trouble is at the moment we have an excessive degree of siloing within our sort of notions. And well, organised crime, that's for criminologists to deal with, and maybe if you're being particularly adventurous, a sociologist or even an anthropologist. But essentially, it's for them. It's not political science. Political science is all about the upper world. It's about states and the like. By positing this notion that organised crime is essentially the shadow of the upper world, and that in fact, often by looking at organised crime, it tells us a lot about the upper world that we wouldn't otherwise see, I think it adds a very important extra dimension. And in terms of the impact on how policymakers think of it, again, it's about taking it away from the silos. This is not just simply something that law enforcement bodies, the Department of Justice or whatever, need to be thinking about. Even on the most basic level, we too often fail to red team, shall we say, legislation and similar political moves. Pretty much anything that states do, someone is going to be sitting there thinking, how do I make a fast buck or many fast bucks out of this? Whether it's banning something, we ban environmentally polluting materials like CFCs, we immediately create a black market in them. Whether it's taxation, which taxation is actually most likely to generate opportunities for the criminals? I mean, in Britain, you almost had local war when taxation on tea became excessive. So I think it's this idea of actually just bringing it in. It's not that it needs to dramatically change our actual policies, but it should be part of the calculus. It should not be something that is just relegated to law enforcement people to then pick up the pieces. We could actually be building an anti-organised crime dimension into much more of our policies from the very beginning.
And on that note, that's a fascinating point at which to end. I want to think that brings our podcast episode to a close. I want to thank Mark for joining us today. Thanks as always to Keelan Wolf, Claude Jennings, the entire NSI staff in helping produce today's episode. Coffee and Conflict is available on Spotify and other fine purveyors of podcasts. This episode will also be available on YouTube and NSI's webpage. Make sure to join us for the next episode in just 2 short weeks. And as always, if you like what you heard or saw, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. But Mark, thank you so much again for joining us for the second time now to discuss Homo Criminalis, which is an absolutely fantastic book, and I highly recommend everybody pick it up for their holiday reads and as a Christmas present as well. Legally,
absolutely.
Of course. Pick it up legally.
I cannot but agree with you entirely. But anyway, thanks very much. It's always great to be on this.